Section 97 of Buddenbrooks by Thomas Mann, translated by Helen Tracy Lowe Porter. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Read by Bruce Perry. Part 11, Chapter 2b. Hanno and Kai met at the door and went down the stairs together, and across the architecturally correct vestibule. They were silent. Hanno looked pathetically unwell, and Kai was deep in thought. They reached the courtyard and began to stroll up and down across the wet red tiles, among school companions of all ages and sizes. A youthful-looking man with a blond pointed beard kept order down here, Dr. Goldener, the dressy one. He kept a pensionnat for the sons of the rich landowners from Mecklenburg and Holstein, and dressed, on account of these aristocratic youths, with an elegance not apparent in the other masters. He wore silk cravats, a dandified coat, and pale-coloured trousers fastened down with straps under the soles of his boots, and used perfumed handkerchiefs with coloured borders. He came of rather simple people, and all this elegance was not very becoming. His large feet, for example, looked absurd in the pointed, buttoned boots he wore. He was vain of his plump red hands, too, and kept rubbing them together, clasping them before him, and regarding them with every mark of admiration. He carried his head laid far back on one side, and constantly made faces by blinking, screwing up his nose, and half opening his mouth, as though he were about to say, "What's the matter now?" But his refinement led him to overlook all sorts of small infractions of the rules. He overlooked this or that pupil who had brought a book with him into the courtyard to prepare a little at the 11th hour. He overlooked the fact that one of his boarding pupils handed money to the porter, Herr Schlemihl, and asked him to get some pastry. He overlooked a small trial of strength between two third-form pupils, which resulted in a beating of one by the other, and around which a ring of connoisseurs was quickly formed. And he overlooked certain sounds behind him which indicated that a pupil who had made himself unpopular by cheating, cowardice, or other weakness, was being forcibly escorted to the pump. It was a lusty, not too gentle race, that of these comrades of Hanno and Kai among whom they walked up and down. The ideals of the victorious united fatherland were those of a somewhat rude masculinity. Its youth talked in a jargon at once brisk and slovenly. The most despised vices were softness and dandyism. The most admired virtues, those displayed by prowess in drinking and smoking, bodily strength and skill in athletics. Whoever went out with his coat-collar turned up incurred a visit to the pump, while he who let himself be seen in the streets with a walking-stick must expect a public and ignominious correction administered in the drill-hall. Hanno's and Kai's conversation was in striking contrast to that which went on around them among their fellows. This friendship had been recognized in the school for a long time. The masters suffered it grudgingly, suspecting that it meant disaffection and future trouble. The pupils could not understand it, but had settled down to regarding it with a sort of embarrassed dislike, and to thinking of the two friends as outlaws and eccentrics who must be left to their own devices. They recognized, it is true, the wildness and insubordination of Kai, Count Muln, and respected him accordingly. As for Hanno Buddenbrook, big Heinrici, who thrashed everybody, could not make up his mind to lay a finger on him by way of chastisement for dandyism or cowardice. He refrained out of an indefinite respect and awe for the softness of Hanno's hair, the delicacy of his limbs, and his sad, shy, cold glance. I'm scared, Hanno said to Kai. He leaned against the wall of the school, drawing his jacket closer about him, yawning and shivering. I'm so scared, Kai, that it hurts me all over my body. Now, just tell me this. Is Herr Montelsack the sort of person one ought to be afraid of? Tell me yourself. If this beastly Ovid lesson were only over, if I just had my bad mark in peace and stopped where I am, and everything was in order, I'm not afraid of that. It is the row that goes beforehand that I hate. Kai was still deep in thought. This Roderick Usher is the most remarkable character ever conceived, he said suddenly and abruptly. I have read the whole lesson hour. If ever I could write a tale like that. Kai was absorbed in his writing. It was to this he had referred when he said that he had something better to do than his preparation, and Hanno had understood him. Attempts at composition had developed out of his old propensity for inventing tales, and he had lately completed a composition in the form of a fantastic fairy tale, a narrative of symbolic adventure, which went forward in the depths of the earth, among glowing metals and mysterious fires, and at the same time in the souls of men. A tale in which the primeval forces of nature and of the soul were interchanged and mingled, transformed and refined, the whole conceived and written in a vein of extravagant and even sentimental symbolism, fervid with passion and longing. Hanno knew the tale well, and loved it, but he was not now in a frame of mind to think of Kai's work or of Edgar Allan Poe. He yawned again, and then sighed, humming to himself a motif he had lately composed on the piano. This was a habit with him. He would often give a long sigh, a deep indrawn breath, from the instinct to calm the fluctuating and irregular action of his heart, and he had accustomed himself to set the deep breathing to a musical theme of his own or someone else's invention. "Look, there comes the Lord God," said Kai. "He is walking in his garden." "Fine garden," said Hanno. He began to laugh nervously and could not stop, putting his handkerchief to his mouth the while and looking across the courtyard at him whom Kai called the Lord God. This was Director Vuleka, the head of the school, who had appeared in the courtyard. An extremely tall man with a slouch hat, a short heavy beard, a prominent abdomen, trousers that were far too short, and very dirty funnel-shaped cuffs. He strode across the flagstones with a face so angry in its expression that he seemed to be actually suffering, and pointed at the pump with outstretched arm. The water was running. A train of pupils ran before him and stumbled in their zeal to repair the damage. Then they stood about, looking first at the pump and then at the director, their faces pictures of distress. And the director, meanwhile, had turned to Dr. Goldener, who hurried up with a very red face and spoke to him in a deep, hollow voice, fairly babbling with excitement between the words. This Director Vuleka was a most formidable man. He had succeeded to the headship of the school after the death, soon after 1871, of the genial and benevolent old gentleman under whose guidance Hanno's father and uncle had pursued their studies. Dr. Vuleka was summoned from a professorship in a Prussian high school, and with his advent an entirely new spirit entered the school. In the old days, the classical course had been thought of as an end in itself, to be pursued at one's ease with a sense of joyous idealism. But now the leading conceptions were authority, duty, power, service, the career. The categorical imperative of our philosopher Kant was inscribed upon the banner which Dr. Wuleke in every official speech unfurled to the breeze. The school became a state within a state, in which not only the masters but the pupils regarded themselves as officials whose main concern was the advancement they could make, and who must therefore take care to stand well with the authorities. Soon after the new director was installed in his office, the tearing down of the old school began, and the new one was built up on the most approved hygienic and aesthetic principles, and everything went swimmingly. But it remained an open question whether the old school, as an institution, with its smaller endowment of modern comfort, and its larger share of gay good nature, courage, charm, and good feeling, had not been more blessed and blessing than the new. As for Dr. Wuleke himself, personally, he had all the awful mystery, duplicity, obstinacy, and jealousy of the Old Testament God. He was as frightful in his smiles as in his anger. The result of the enormous authority that lay in his hands was that he grew more and more arbitrary and moody. He was even capable of making a joke, and then visiting with his wrath anybody who dared to laugh. Not one of his trembling creatures knew how to act before him. They found it safest to honor him in the dust, and to protect themselves by a frantic abasement from the fate of being whirled up in the cloud of his wrath and crushed forever under the weight of his righteous displeasure. The name Kai had given Dr. Wuleke was known only to himself and Hanno, and they took the greatest pains not to let any of the others overhear it, for they could not possibly understand. No, there was not one single point on which those two stood on common ground with their schoolfellows. Even the methods of revenge, of getting even, which obtained in the school, were foreign to Hanno and Kai, and they utterly disdained the current nicknames, which did not in the least appeal to their more subtle sense of humor. It was so poor, it showed such a paucity of invention, to call thin Professor Hookup Spider, and Herr Ballerstedt Cocky. It was such scant compensation for their compulsory service to the state. No, Count Muln, flattered himself that he was not so feeble as that. He invented, for his own and Hanno's use, a method of alluding to all their masters by their actual names, with the simple prefix thus: Herr Ballerstedt, Herr Hookup. The irony of this, its chilly remoteness and mockery, pleased him very much. He liked to speak of the teaching body, and would amuse himself for whole recesses with imagining it as an actual creature, a sort of monster with a repulsively fantastic form. And they spoke in general of the institution as if it were similar to that which harbored Hanno's uncle Christian. Kai's mood improved at the sight of the Lord God, who still pervaded the playground and put everybody in a pallid fright by pointing with fearful rumblings to the wrapping papers from the luncheons which strewed the courtyard. The two lads went off to one of the gates, through which the masters in charge of the second period were now entering. Kai began to make bows of exaggerated respect before the red-eyed, pale, shabby-looking seminarists who crossed over to go to their 6th and 7th form pupils in the back court. And when the grey-haired mathematics master, Herr Tiedtke, appeared, holding a bundle of books on his back with a shaking hand, bent, yellow, cross-eyed, spitting as he walked along, Kai said, "Good morning, old dead man." He said this in a loud voice and gazed straight up into the air with his bright, sharp gaze. Then the bell clanged loudly, and the pupils began to stream through the entrances into the building. Hanno could not stop laughing. He was still laughing so hard on the stairs that his classmates looked at him and Kai with wonder and cold hostility, and even with a slight disgust at such frivolity. There was a sudden hush in the classroom, and everybody stood up as Herr Professor Montelzack entered. He was the Professor Ordinarius, for whom it was usual to show respect. He pulled the door to after him, bowed, craned his neck to see if all the class were standing up, hung his hat on its nail, and went quickly to the platform, moving his head rapidly up and down as he went. He took his place and stood for a while looking out the window and running his forefinger, with a large seal ring on it, around inside his collar. He was a man of medium size, with thin grey hair, a curled Olympian beard, and short-sighted prominent sapphire blue eyes gleaming behind his spectacles. He was dressed in an open frock coat of soft grey material, which he habitually settled at the waist with his short-fingered, wrinkled hand. His trousers were, like all the other masters, even the elegant Dr. Goldener's, far too short, and showed the legs of a pair of very broad and shiny boots. He turned sharply away from the window and gave vent to a little good-natured sigh, smiling familiarly at several pupils. His mood was obviously good, and a wave of relief ran through the classroom. So much, everything, in fact, depended on whether Dr. Montelzack was in a good mood. For the whole form was aware that he gave way to the feeling of the moment, whatever that might happen to be, without the slightest restraint. He was most extraordinarily, boundlessly, naively unjust, and his favour was as inconstant as that of Fortune herself. He had always a few favourites, 2 or 3, whom he called by their given names, and these lived in paradise. They might say almost anything they liked, and after the lesson Dr. Montelzack would talk with them just like a human being. But a day would come, perhaps after the holidays, when for no apparent reason they were dethroned, cast out, rejected, and others elevated to their place. The mistakes of these favourites would be passed over with neat, careful corrections, so that their work retained a respectable appearance, no matter how bad it was, whereas he would attack the other copybooks with heavy, ruthless pen, and fairly flood them with red ink, so that their appearance was shocking indeed. And as he never troubled to count the mistakes, but distributed bad marks in proportion to the red ink he had expended, his favourites always emerged with great credit from these exercises. He was not even aware of the rank injustice of this conduct, and if anybody had ever had the temerity to call his attention to it, that person would have been for ever deprived of even the chance of becoming a favourite and being called by his first name. There was nobody who was willing to let slip the chance. Now Dr. Montelzack crossed his legs, still standing, and began to turn over the leaves of his notebook. Hanno Buddenbrook wrung his hands under the desk. B, the letter B, came next. Now he would hear his name, he would get up, he would not know a line, and there would be a row, a loud, frightful catastrophe, no matter how good a mood Dr. Montelzack might be in. The seconds dragged out, each a martyrdom. Buddenbrook. Now he would say Buddenbrook. "Edgar," said Dr. Montelzack, closing his notebook with his finger in it. He sat down, as if all were in the best of order. "What? Who? Edgar? That was Luders, the fat Luders boy over there by the window. Letter L, which was not next at all. No. Was it possible? Dr. Montelzac's mood was so good that he simply selected one of his favorites without troubling in the least about whose turn it was? Luders stood up. He had a face like a pug dog, and dull brown eyes. He had an advantageous seat, and could easily have read it off, but he was too lazy. He felt too secure in his paradise, and answered simply, "I had a headache yesterday, and couldn't study." "Oh, so you are leaving me in the lurch, Edgar," said Dr. Montelzac, with tender reproach. "You cannot say the lines on the Golden Age? What a shocking pity, my friend! You had a headache. It seems to me you should have told me before the lesson began, instead of waiting till I called you up. Didn't you have a headache just lately, Edgar? You should do something for them, for otherwise there is danger of your not passing. Tim, will you take his place?" Luders sat down. At this moment he was the object of universal hatred. It was plain that the master's mood had altered for the worse, and that Luders, perhaps in the very next lesson, would be called by his last name. Tim stood up in one of the back seats. He was a blond, country-looking lad with a light brown jacket and short, broad fingers. He held his mouth open in a funnel shape, and hastily found the place, looking straight ahead the while with the most idiotic expression. Then he put down his head and began to read, in long drawn-out, monotonous, hesitating accents, like a child with a first lesson-book. "Aurea prima sata est oitas." It was plain that Dr. Montelzac was calling up quite at random, without reference to the alphabet, and thus it was no longer so imminently likely that Hanno would be called on, though this might happen through unlucky chance. He exchanged a joyful glance with Kai, and began to relax somewhat. But now Tim's reading was interrupted. Whether Dr. Montelzac could not hear him, or whether he stood in need of exercise, is not to be known. But he left his platform and walked slowly down through the room. He paused near Tim with his book in his hand. Tim, meanwhile, had succeeded in getting his own book out of sight, but was now entirely helpless. His funnel-shaped mouth emitted a gasp, and he looked at the ordinarius with honest, troubled blue eyes, and could not fetch out another syllable. "Well, Tim," said Dr. Montelzac, "can't you get on?" Tim clutched his brow, rolled up his eyes, sighed windily, and said with a dazed smile, "I get all mixed up, Herr Doctor, when you stand so close to me." Dr. Montelzac smiled too. He smiled in a very flattered way, and said, "Well, pull yourself together and get on," and he strolled back to his place. And Tim pulled himself together. He drew out and opened his book again, all the while apparently wrestling to recover his self-control and staring about the room. Then he dropped his head and was himself again. "Very good," said the master, when he had finished. "It is clear that you have studied to some purpose. But you sacrifice the rhythm too much, Tim. You seem to understand the elisions, yet you have not been really reading hexameters at all. I have an impression as if you had learned the whole thing by heart, like prose. But, as I say, you have been diligent, you have done your best, and whoever does his best. You may sit down." Tim sat down, proud and beaming, and Dr. Montelzac gave him a good mark in his book. And the extraordinary thing was that at this moment, not only the master, but also Tim himself and all his classmates sincerely felt that Tim was a good, industrious pupil who had fully deserved the mark he got. Hanno Buddenbrook even thought the same, though something within him revolted against the thought. He listened with strained attention to the next name. "Mamma, said Dr. Montelsac. Again, aria prima. Mamma! Well, thank heaven! Hannah was now in probable safety. The lines would hardly be asked for a third time, and in the sight reading the letter B had just been called up. Mamma got up. He was tall and pale, with trembling hands and extraordinarily large round glasses. He had trouble with his eyes, and was so short-sighted that he could not possibly read standing up from a book on the desk before him. He had to learn, and he had learned. But to-day he had not expected to be called up. He was, besides, painfully ungifted, and he stuck after the first few words. Dr. Montelsac helped him. He helped him again in a sharper tone, and for the third time with intense irritation. But when Mamma came to a final stop, the ordinarius was mastered by indignation. "This is entirely insufficient, Mamma. Sit down. You cut a disgraceful figure, let me tell you, sir. A cretin. Stupid and lazy both. It is really too much." Mamma was overwhelmed. He looked the child of calamity, and at this moment everybody in the room despised him. A sort of disgust, almost like nausea, mounted again in Hanno Buddenbrook's throat. But at the same time he observed, with horrible clarity, all that was going forward. Dr. Montelsac made a mark of sinister meaning after Mamma's name, and then looked through his notebook with frowning brows. He went over, in his disgust, to the order of the day, and looked to see whose turn it really was. There was no doubt that this was the case, and just as Hanno was overpowered by this knowledge, he heard his name, as if in a bad dream. Buddenbrook. Dr. Montelsac had said Buddenbrook. The scale was in the air again. Hanno could not believe his senses. There was a buzzing in his ears. He sat still. "Herr Buddenbrook?" said Dr. Montelsac, and stared at him sharply through his glasses with his prominent sapphire blue eyes. "Will you have the goodness?" Very well, then, it was to be. It had to come. It had come differently from his expectations, but still here it was, and he was none the less lost. But he was calm. Would it be a very big row? He rose in his place, and was about to utter some forlorn and absurd excuse to the effect that he had forgotten to study the lines, when he became aware that the boy ahead of him was offering him his open book. This boy, Hans Hermann Kilian, was a small brown lad with oily hair and broad shoulders. He had set his heart on becoming an officer, and was so possessed by an ideal of comradeship that he would not leave in the lurch even little Buddenbrook, whom he did not like. He pointed with his finger to the place. Hanno gazed down upon it, and began to read. With trembling voice, his face working, he read of the golden age, when truth and justice flourished of their own free will, without laws or compulsions. Punishment and fear did not exist, he said in Latin. No threats were graven upon the bronze tablets, nor did those who came to petition fear the countenance of the judges. He read in fear and trembling, read with design, badly and disjointedly, purposely omitted some of the elisions that were marked with pencil in Kilian's book, made mistakes in the lines, progressed with apparent difficulty, and constantly expected the master to discover the fraud and pounce upon him. The guilty satisfaction of seeing the open book in front of him gave him a pricking sensation in his skin, but at the same time he had such a feeling of disgust that he intentionally deceived as badly as possible, simply to make the deceit seem less vulgar to himself. He came to the end, and a pause ensued, during which he did not dare look up. He felt convinced that Dr. Montalzac had seen all, and his lips were perfectly white. But at length the master sighed and said, "Oh, Buddenbrook, si tacoises, you will permit me the classical thou for this once. Do you know what you have done? You have conducted yourself like a vandal, a barbarian. You are a humorist, Buddenbrook, I can see that by your face. If I ask myself whether you have been coughing, or whether you have been reciting this noble verse, I should incline to the former. Tim showed small feeling for rhythm, but compared to you he is a genius, a rhapsodist. Sit down, unhappy wretch. You have studied the lines, I cannot deny it, and I am constrained to give you a good mark. You have probably done your best. But tell me, have I not been told that you are musical, that you play the piano? How is it possible? Well, very well, sit down. You have worked hard, that must suffice." He put a good mark down in his book, and Hanno Buddenbrook took his seat. He felt, as Tim the rhapsodist had felt before him, that he really deserved the praise which Dr. Montalzac gave him. Yes, at that moment he was of the opinion that he was, if rather a dull, yet an industrious pupil, who had come off with honour, comparatively speaking. He was conscious that all his schoolmates, not excepting Hans Hermann Kilian, had the same view. Yet he felt at the same time somewhat nauseated. Pale, trembling, too exhausted to think about what had happened, he closed his eyes and sank back in lethargy. Dr. Montalzac, however, went on with the lesson. He came to the verses that were to have been prepared for to-day, and called up Petersen. Petersen rose, fresh, lively, sanguine, in a stout attitude, ready for the fray. Yet to-day, even to-day, was destined to see his fall. Yes, the lesson hour was not to pass without a catastrophe far worse than that which had befallen the hapless, short-sighted Mumma. Petersen translated, glancing now and then at the other page of his book, which should have had nothing on it. He did it quite cleverly. He acted as though something there distracted him, a speck of dust, perhaps, which he brushed with his hand, or tried to blow away. And yet there followed the catastrophe. Dr. Montalzac made a sudden violent movement, which was responded to on Petersen's part by a similar movement. And in the same moment the master left his seat, dashed headlong down from his platform, and approached Petersen with long, impetuous strides. "You have a crib in your book," he said as he came up. "A crib? No," stammered Petersen. He was a charming lad, with a great wave of blonde hair on his forehead, and lovely blue eyes, which now flickered in a frightened way. "You have no crib in your book?" "A crib, Herr Doctor? No, really, I haven't. You are mistaken. You are accusing me falsely." Petersen betrayed himself by the unnatural correctness of his language, which he used in order to intimidate the master. "I am not deceiving you," he repeated, in the greatness of his need. "I have always been honourable, my whole life long." But Dr. Montalzac was all too certain of the painful fact. "Give me your book," he said coldly. Petersen clung to his book. He raised it up in both hands and went on protesting. He stammered, his tongue grew thick. "Believe me, Herr Doctor, there is nothing in the book. I have no crib. I have not deceived you. I have always been honourable." "Give me your book," repeated the master, stamping his foot. Then Petersen collapsed, and his face grew grey. "Very well," said he, and delivered up his book. "Here it is. Yes, there is a crib in it. You can see for yourself, there it is. But I haven't used it," he suddenly shrieked, quite at random. Dr. Mantelzach ignored this idiotic lie, which was rooted in despair. He drew out the crib, looked at it with an expression of extreme disgust, as if it were a piece of decaying offal, thrust it into his pocket, and threw the volume of Ovid contemptuously back on Petersen's desk. "Give me the class register," he said in a hollow voice. Adolf Totenhaupt dutifully fetched it, and Petersen received a mark for dishonesty, which effectually demolished his chances of being sent up at Easter. "You are the shame of the class," said Dr. Mantelzach. Petersen sat down. He was condemned. His neighbor avoided contact with him. Everyone looked at him with a mixture of pity, aversion, and disgust. He had fallen, utterly and completely, because he had been found out. There was but one opinion as to Petersen, and that was that he was, in very truth, the shame of the class. They recognized and accepted his fall, as they had the rise of Tim and Buddenbrook, and the unhappy Mumme's mischance. And Petersen did too. Thus, most of this class of 25 young folk, being of sound and strong constitution, armed and prepared to wage the battle of life as it is, took things just as they found them, and did not at this moment feel any offence or uneasiness. Everything seemed to them to be quite in order. But one pair of eyes, little Johann's, which stared gloomily at a point on Hans Hermann Kilion's broad back, were filled in their blue-shadowed depths with abhorrence, fear, and revulsion. The lesson went on. Dr. Mantelzach called on somebody, anybody. He had lost all desire to test anyone. And after Adolf Totenhaupt, another pupil, who was but moderately prepared, and did not even know what patula Jovis arbore meant, had been called on, Buddenbrook had to say it. He said it in a low voice, without looking up, because Dr. Mantelzach asked him, and he received a nod of the head for the answer. And now that the performance of the pupils was over, the lesson had lost all interest. Dr. Mantelzach had one of the best scholars read at his own sweet will, and listened just as little as the 24 others, who began to get ready for the next class. This one was finished, in effect. No one could be marked on it, nor his interest or industry judged, and the bell would soon ring. It did ring. It rang for Hanno, and he had received a nod of approbation. Thus it was. "Well," said Kai to Hanno, as they walked down the Gothic corridor with their classmates to go to the chemistry class, "what do you say now about the brow of Caesar? You had wonderful luck." "I feel sick, Kai," said little Johann. "I don't like that kind of luck. It makes me sick." Kai knew he would have felt the same in Hanno's place. End of section 97.